Hello, and welcome to episode 149 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And I'm John Dinning in Los Angeles.
John, it's been a little bit, but we got more new LSAT news coming out. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, that's why it's been a little bit, frankly, as we've been distracted by all the updates that keep coming through. We'll talk about one here tonight.
That's right. Last time we talked about all the new tests that were coming out and everything. Here we've got a new LSAT writing format. Obviously, any changes in the LSAT drive us to drink, so I want to know what you're drinking.
I love that you had to make it that specific. Anything drives me to drink, period. Given what a headache this is going to be, I thought I would indulge my sympathetic side and take a self-induced headache with a Long Island iced tea. So I didn't really know the ingredients, or at least I did most of this from memory. So Dave, you can tell me how badly I've screwed this up. There's some vodka, some rum, some tequila, some gin. I didn't have any sweet and sour mix, which I think is supposed to go in there. I think there's a little triple sec, but I didn't know how much, so that was just a dash. And then Coca-Cola, to be clear. But yeah, it's just an absolute mess over here. It's not that bad, but I'm going to regret it.
Well, I think maybe you're missing the lemon twist that goes on there.
No, I'm fruity enough.
You're still missing it. That's actually one of my favorite drinks. It sounds close enough to me. Whenever I think of a Long Island, I'm like, just throw a bunch of alcohol in there with Coke and you're good.
Yeah. I just grabbed an armful of stuff off the bar and that's what I made a drink with. So there you go.
I know it has tequila. I didn't really, maybe gin. I can't remember. I don't make the Long Islands around here, so I don't really know, but maybe there is that in there.
I wasn't so sure about the gin and I didn't bother looking it up. What do you got?
I like that. I didn't bother at all. I've got a strange drink, actually, and I was thinking about this idea of the makers of this test trying to inject new blood into really what's been a tired writing format for a while. And so the drink that I'm having is called a transfusion, so kind of that injection, new blood idea. And essentially what it is vodka, grape juice, like regular Concord, kind of like thick grape juice, not the wine grape juice I'm used to, and ginger ale. So it's not bad. It's a little strange. I can live with it though.
I would drink that. Does it somehow turn like a reddish color? Because that's when I think of transfusions. I think of something kind of bloody.
Yeah, a little bit, but it's still got more of that purpley kind of look to it. Because it's, the ginger ale is not that dark. And then the Tito's is obviously kind of just like straight up clear. So it takes that really dark purple grape juice and lightens it up a little bit. I wouldn't say it makes it reddish, but purpley. That's the best I got for you.
Well, there you go. You can tell how excited we're to talk about the writing sample as we spend 5 minutes on our drinks. Let's move on. You kind of went for the song tonight, so I'll let you take that over.
Yeah, we know that it's going to be a new day for the LSAT writing, and so the song I chose is actually from 1987. The artist is Baja. The song is "New Day for You," and the reason that I chose Baja is that a good friend of ours that we work with happens to be a huge Baja fan. So I used to hear this song all the time, and it immediately just came to mind. It's pretty catchy, but it's also a little old at this point. 1987,
a little old school. But there you go. All right, a throwback. Let's get into the LSAT world because there's a few things going on, but not as much as we sometimes see. So this should be pretty quick.
This is the slow season. What's the scene with the upcoming LSATs?
Well, there's two that I think people have got in mind. One, obviously, the next one coming up in just a couple of weeks here. The April LSAT starts on, I believe, Thursday, April 11th, runs Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So through the 13th. The registration for this test has closed. So if you're not signed up for April, you missed your window. After that comes the June LSAT, which is June 6th, 7th, and 8th. That registration's still open. In fact, it's open for about 3 more weeks or so, maybe 4 more weeks. Closes almost 4. Closes April 23rd. The bad news of this, as we'll talk about in just a second, that is before the April scores come out. So if you're taking April and waiting to see what happens before you get registered for June, you're not going to know. You have to sign up for June before you get April results. I hate when they do that. They've done it here.
There's no reason for them to have done it here, so I criticize them on that front. But if you feel like, hey, I've got to get in position for improved reconsideration offers or getting off the wait list, I already know a number of students who are like, well, I'm not going to know my score, so I better have June in my pocket just in case, and then I can withdraw if needed. Sucks. Feels a little bit like a money grab, and I've seen them do this before where they changed things and made it less of a money grab. I'm hoping they'll do that in this particular instance because it seems like there's a lot of time between April and June. Maybe they can adjust that, and sometimes they do that.
Yeah, there's of course another motivating factor around that June test, which is it's the last test that we'll ever see, presumably, with a logic game section on it. So if you are good at logic games and you're on the fence about June, please take June. After that, you're not going to have a chance to capitalize on what could be your strong suit. Starting in August, of course, we won't see games anymore. We've covered that plenty, so I won't go any further into it.
That is exactly the case. And if you're taking any of these LSATs that are coming up, we've got a couple free seminars for you on April 2nd. We've got the LSAT 101 for the new LSAT that John just mentioned, which is the double LR 1 RC scored format. And then since RC is getting even more and more important, here we have on April 16th, the RC skills test webinar that is floating around. And if you are taking April or June, one thing we'll mention is that the crystal ball that we did for both those tests, which we did back on March 6th, you can go to our website, go to powerscore.com/LSAT, and there is a form there that you can use to access that. Now, the question that we have, John, is we know that that's pointed at both April and June. We have mentioned in the past that depending on what happens in April, we might do a little mini ball, which means we update what we did in April specifically for June. What are your thoughts on that right now?
Well, we did it last year between the April and the June tests, so it wouldn't be unprecedented. I've been getting, 3 to 10 questions a day about it pretty much since we did the one on March 6th. So I know people are kind of clamoring for it, or at least eager to see what we have to say. I don't know yet. I don't think you do either. We're going to have to see what happens here in April to know whether or not our predictions need to change or get updated. But here's my expectation. If we do one, I think we probably do it on May 1st, which is a Wednesday.
Yeah. I think both our schedules are pretty good for that. And just to explain briefly the difference, in the crystal ball, we actually go back and take an analysis of all the different question types in each section, the likelihoods. We go through what the most likely type of games are. We look at different reading comprehension passage types. We look at what's the most frequent logical reasoning question type to appear and which groupings are more likely to appear. In the mini ball, we don't do that. It's a shorter format. We actually go more into the predictions and talk about it. And what happened last year was that when we did April, we predicted so much of it that there wasn't enough left over for June. So we said, hey, let's do a miniature version of it, but not have to go through all the question types, which wouldn't change from one test to another like that with no release test there. So that's what we may very well do this year. We'll probably post that on our website at some point here, just tentatively, so that if you need to enroll and get on the list and have those reminders, you can go ahead and do that. But it would probably be May 1st if you're looking at your calendar right now.
There you go. I'm looking at mine, so it's already penciled in. We'll see what happens.
We will indeed. So let's get to the main event then, and that is the new LSAT writing format that LSAC announced less than a week ago. And a little bit of a surprise to me. I wasn't aware of the fact that they were working on this. When I read what they put out about it, I kind of understood what direction they were about to take with this. So we'll cover a little bit of the future of this at the very end. But let's talk a little bit about the past first, John, and maybe give a little bit of a background on where things stand with the LSAT writing and how we got to this point.
Yeah, I think this time of year especially it's important because a lot of people listening to this right now have probably never done an LSAT writing essay before. April, June, a lot of times for people this is the beginning of the cycle, so they don't know. So first thing I'll say about LSAT writing in terms of the prior version is that we've already covered it in some detail all the way back, probably years and years ago in episode 15. We devoted an entire episode of how to actually do the essay. Some of that will still hold, as you'll see. Some of that's going to change. But if you want to learn about the current version, that's probably the best place to go. I'll move through this then pretty quickly. So what has it been traditionally? Well, there have been a couple of versions that we've seen. Prior to the digital test that started back in 2019 and then kind of continued over to Flex in 20, it was just an unscored 35-minute mandatory essay that was administered during the test itself. At the very end of the exam, you would do 5 scored sections and then a 35-minute writing. section, an essay basically. That was brutal. When they moved to the digital test, they separated it from the actual test administration itself. So you would take the test and you could go home or do the writing before, during, after, whenever you really wanted to. That was a gift for people. I think most people liked that better, obviously. They weren't held hostage for it. But a completed essay was still required before you could get your score. And we'll talk more about that as we go. But they separated it out from the test, and that's how it's been for really about the last 4 years or so now. It also had a really unique format. And if you want to interject here at any point, Dave, obviously feel free.
Yeah, before you get to the format, I will say this. It used to be back in the old days, more than 5 years ago, that this was part of the actual LSAT administration that you took.
That's right. You
point out the separation. When it first started out, you took it before the LSAT.
Mm-hmm.
Like you'd walk in and the first thing you did was the LSAT writing, or the writing sample, as they called it, be 30 minutes. And then they switched it to the end because they're like, we're burning up valuable like focus and energy time on this essay. So then they flipped it to the end. And then eventually, as we started getting into this digital format, they completely separated it away from it. So they've tried various things, various essays over the year. But the one that we're dealing with right now, John, as you know, is called the decision prompt. How does that set itself up?
Yeah, that's the current format of this. And in short, if you've never seen this, you'd probably want to go look one up to understand what I'm about to say. I'll do my best. What they give you essentially are 2 goals that you're trying to meet, 2 criteria really that you're trying to satisfy. So maybe you want to increase tourism to a town, but you also want to create jobs for the locals. And then there's 2 possible courses of action you could take, basically a paragraph that outlines 2 different paths you could follow. One of those paths tends to satisfy one of the goals pretty well, but fail the other. The other pathway tends to satisfy the other goal, but fail the first. So to increase tourism, you renovate a local park, but it doesn't create jobs. To create jobs, you build a big factory, but it doesn't really help tourism because it's gross. You have to pick. And that was essentially the decision prompt of what this was. So you've got one action that meets a goal well, fails the other, and then vice versa. What I always found interesting about this, Dave, is on a test that really is judging you solely on your ability to determine between right and wrong answers, there was no right or wrong answer to this. This was a free choice. There wasn't a right or wrong. And again, it also wasn't, for a test that hinges everything on a score from 180, it wasn't scored. They didn't assign any kind of value or metric to this at all. So you've got no right answer as you write the essay, and you've got really no metric or criteria to evaluate how well it was written. I always found that very odd. Yeah.
It was style exercise. No right or wrong, and you could argue either side and make a cogent argument and get points. It was all about how you performed and what it looked like if somebody actually sat down and read it. And quite honestly, there was certainly a lot of discussion over how many schools really did read it closely, how many schools even just glanced at it, and then depending on even how they looked at it, how much they weighted it. But there was always this kind of theory that in some cases they'd back check students, especially international students, to say, hey, how does your writing style in your personal statement or your resume match up to what you've actually done in this timed exercise that we know is you? And so there was certainly, various usages of it. And I've had law school professionals tell me, no, we do check that. We look at it and we just glance at it. I'm like, if you're just glancing at it, it's not super important. But the goal was always to do it and do a good job. And LSAC has continued to say over the years that law schools really want this, and they have a strong preference for a written component to the test. And of course, LSAC would say that. They have a vested interest in saying that anything that they do is useful to the law school. So I've heard some support for that view, and I've heard directly from law schools who are like, look, I don't have time to read it. And I don't, I'm not reading the prompt. I'm not going to go through it and see how good the argument is. Maybe if I have an outlier case that I really want to check, I will. And I think that was really the greatest value of it, aside from some small value in seeing it. So an interesting exercise, but they're definitely making changes to it now.
What I will say, the last thing about the decision prompt that I enjoyed is because it wasn't scored and because it wasn't, again, there was no right or wrong answer. You couldn't really make a mistake unless you just failed to be persuasive. It really was just about your ability to craft a cogent argument and consider all viewpoints. Take everything into consideration and then stylistically weight them against each other. I like that. It's the only time on the test where there's some subjectivity.
Yeah, let's put it this way. I didn't think there was some fundamental flaw in the current format. Clearly, they disagreed.
Yeah, apparently they do.
So how is it going to change then, John?
Well, first thing to note is it doesn't change until July 31st of this year. So the first people who are probably going to encounter this, unless it's a bunch of June people who just waited a long time to submit one, are people starting the test in August. And that is when both the structure and the task are going to be vastly different, and genuinely vastly different from the current format. And here's the way that the new one is going to stack up. And again, we'll talk in a minute about examples you can actually go check out.
And before you get to that, we'll talk at the end here about, hey, which test are you taking? Do you need a new versus old writing, sample out there and so forth? So we'll come to all those questions. Let's talk a little bit about how it looks, though.
Yeah, if you're hearing this and dreading it, you might get off the hook. But before we get to that, the way that this is actually outlined now is you're just presented at first with kind of a background or a context paragraph about the overall issue that's up for debate. And this is still argumentative. This is still debate-based and opinion-based, but they just give you some background context. The current example that's out there is about the purpose of college. Is it to educate you? Is it to prepare you for a career? Is it to instill some sort of grounding or social skills? And there's just a paragraph that doesn't even really take a stance. It just talks about the nature of the issue. And then they have what they call a key question. And this is what your essay or your argument's intended to answer or address. In the current case, to what extent do colleges and universities serve their students' best interests when they emphasize career preparation? There's the question. To what extent? Notice it's not yes or no. You actually do have to kind of take a stance here that's greater than the binary. An extent, obviously, implies degree. So you have to think about the key question from that kind of angle. How is it that I'm going to address this in a way that would be both responsive and persuasive to some reader? And here's where it gets really interesting, because up to this point, they could just ask you to answer it. That's not what they do, though. After that, they provide, I've only seen one example, but 4 different perspectives, as they call them. And each of these is expandable. It's another paragraph apiece, and they provide additional context for the issue. But this is where you get to see other people's arguments about it. And again, kind of interesting. So you get context, you get a single question that you're meant to answer, and then you get different viewpoints from people about that key issue on that context. Your essay then is meant to answer the question by responding to the perspectives. And that's the way that this is actually built. You write an argumentative essay in which you take a position within this really ongoing conversation and address, as they say, at least one of the arguments and ideas in those other people's perspectives. At least one. You could attempt for all 4. I wouldn't recommend it. But 1 or 2, I think, is what most people will probably do. But this gives you a whole lot of choice, really. Some freedom as you go through this, because you get to pick what it is that you want to ignore, what it is that you want to respond to. And then you get to think about how to respond to serve whatever answer you have to the key question up top, really.
Yeah, you can agree or disagree with the viewpoints that have been presented. You can interject your own thoughts and perspectives on what you were doing. I'd like to second that point that you just made, though. Do not attempt to use all 4 of the viewpoints. You're going to get too scattershot. It's going to try to cover too much ground. You don't have enough time for that. I would definitely limit it to 1 or 2. I know that when I read this example and I went through it, 1 or 2 of the kind of responses, I just really was like, yeah, whatever. One of them, I was like, I don't like that. And I knew immediately that I would probably attack that person and then use some information from one of the other ones to kind of support that particular attack and, develop my own response on that. But you might notice right away that you're talking about more reading and more thinking, because you're now juggling more perspectives. It's not just 2 bullet points and like which one works and which one doesn't for each of these options. There's now a lot more. Can we get all that done in just 35 minutes?
Yeah, this is far more convoluted. And you mentioned the thing about you won't have time to address all 4 perspectives. In large part, that's not just because of how much reading you have to do and how much you have to write. It's because they've kept the essay portion of this the same length, 35 minutes. So that's how long you're really going to have to write it. What they have done, though, and a bit of generosity, I get to say that very often, is they have added what they call a pre-writing portion, really just a planning phase to this, that's up to 15 minutes long. It can be anywhere from 5 to 15, that's your choice, but you do have time in the beginning and a notes portion of the interface where you can type and save your notes, where you can actually plan this thing out, make a little whatever you want to call it, essay outline or something. I think that's hugely helpful. I think people are going to underutilize it, unfortunately, but that's a very, very useful part of this. Get up to 15 minutes to sit there and strategize. That's excellent.
Yeah,
and that's new.
Essentially,
you did not have that on the old decision prompts, the current version of the essay. You just read it, started writing, your timer went right away.
Yeah, in the old format, your 35 minutes really covered both the kind of like thinking part, the reading part, and the actual writing part. Now it's divided into 2 segments where you have that 5 to 15 minute window to think and kind of like prepare, and then you have 35 minutes to write. So you're going to be in there between 40 and 50 minutes. That's essentially a known factor. I know some people will be like, I got this after 5 minutes. I would strongly recommend that you not just move on after 5 minutes. Reread some parts of it, make some additional notes, give yourself an outline so that when you do start writing, you've got a really clear picture in your head. Especially because as we go forward, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, it's likely that they will study some of these early ones and see what they think of the responses. They may give this a little bit more weight going forward, and eventually maybe even more weight. So the other thing to remember is if you are an accommodated student, you can get additional time. So the 15 plus 35 format is their standard, but if you have accommodations, one or both of those parts can be extended depending upon what you request. So it's an interesting format that they've changed because they're really interjecting a lot more views that are preset that you now have to react to. It's not so much about balancing criteria. It's more about how do these views influence what I think and where I'm going to go with this. And LSAC has said that the idea of this essay is it's designed to give test takers a clearer, more authentic writing purpose than the former decision-based LSAT writing prompt, which happened to be more focused on pure logical reasoning. And look, I mean, you're writing, so I don't think it's focused purely on logical reasoning, but they say more narrowly focused on that. Sometimes I don't love the way they describe things, but I'm sure they don't love the way I describe things either. So, point, counterpoint.
Yeah. Where I think this gets a little more into a creative writing exercise, or at least a little more into a student choice exercise, is you can pick and choose among the prompts, and you can pick and choose what view you want to take and try to support or defend. Dave, I did the same thing when I was reading through this one about college. I read all 4 of the prompts and just waited to see what my emotional response was going to be. Where do I have a reaction that's the strongest? Favorable, negative, what do I love, what do I hate? And those were the ones I responded to were the ones that I would have addressed. I wonder if they were the same ones as yours. We can discuss later or never, ever at all.
We'll check offline.
Maybe, yeah.
I think the last one, which was about the idea of students really, it has to be more of a dialogue and less of a monologue. That was the one I objected to some extent. Because I was like, look, you're going there to learn from others who are hopefully more knowledgeable than you. Yes, it has to be a dialogue, but it is not an even dialogue. I don't love the way they said that.
Yeah,
but
I was laughing, spoken like someone with a kid. Just shut up and listen.
Spoken by like somebody who teaches a lot of classes. It doesn't matter how you look at it.
Lots of kids.
I love student dialogue and debate, and I love being asked questions and tested. The way they phrased that, though, wasn't that. It was almost like we all learned from each other, and I didn't love the way it was phrased. There's a way to phrase that where I would have been a lot more receptive to it. So I don't want to get it twisted here. I love that idea. I just didn't love the way they phrased it. It did not sound right to me.
But notice what you did there is you picked it apart in a way that was very analytical and very detailed and specific. That's what they're looking for you to do. And that's kind of the luxury or the privilege you get with this. It's not interpretive so much as it is just, what did they say? What do I think? How well can I defend that? How well can I destroy that? And then you can bring in examples. You can do different things, as we'll discuss in just a minute. We'll talk in just a second if you're wondering about actually what you should do, the process to writing a good one of these. So stay tuned.
All right, so we know what it's changing towards and the direction they're taking. Let's talk about a few of the things that aren't changing with this new format. And the first one is really a very important one, and that is the delivery of this. You're going to continue to do your LSAT writing online in a remotely proctored environment, just like we have now. It's still going to be this kind of scenario where for each test, LSAT Writing opens 8 days prior to the primary test days, stays open for a while afterwards, and then closes again. So the process around getting in there and writing this is going to be identical to what we have right now. You also have the similar issue that we face currently, which is if you don't have a writing on file, your scores will not be released. And so you have to do one at some point. You can't get away from this or just ignore it. If you're going to take the LSAT and get a score and have that released to schools, you've got to have an LSAT writing on file. The last thing I think is really important is that for now, and we'll get back to this later, it is still an unscored exercise. So they're not going to score it. They're just going to make a copy of it and send it to every law school that you apply to. And then the law school can use it however they wish. They can read it closely and rip apart your writing. They can glance at it and not really care. They don't even have to look at it if they don't want to. And I'm sure all of those outcomes will occur.
Yeah, all three of those are definitely going to happen. And a lot of it's based on the school. A lot of it's based on the applicant. You mentioned international applicants before. Another one that comes to mind is an old college roommate of mine who was a math genius, but couldn't string 3 sentences together. And he'd get A's in calculus and like C's and D's in English 101. He, applying to law school, I promise they're going to read his essays. He had red flags galore. Things like that could trigger a view of this. So just keep in mind who you are in the eyes of a law school, because I do think that's going to play into it as well.
I mean, he was your roommate, so clearly he had red flags.
By choice, too, which was the craziest part.
That's even worse.
Yeah, he agreed to it.
Poor sucker.
All right. Well, I wish you would listen to this part. How should you approach the essay to write a good one? It's a little too late, but let's talk about how to go through it. We mentioned this already, but I cannot stress enough, so I'll reiterate. Use that full 15 minutes of pre-writing time. We said at 5 minutes into it, you can skip ahead and start your 35-minute essay, but take the full time to plan. It's worth it. And those notes that you make, they persist for you, but they don't go to schools. So don't worry about grammatical mistakes. You can shorthand, you can have typos. The key there is that you just get your thoughts down in a way that allows them to be useful later, but don't have any fear about like visibility of that. The key during the pre-writing especially is to think about the key question and your initial thoughts on it. Things you've read, details or facts you might know, even personal experience is allowed here. Personal experience is a pretty broad category. It can be a friend's experience. That's one that you feel could have been your own. I feel like there's a degree of fiction that's allowed here. Maybe I'm over the line in saying that. But to me, personal experience really does kind of allow for like, well, I saw on a TV show one time, so here's the thing. You don't have to source it. You can just say it's a thing. So they're allowing this kind of free-ranging incorporation of, quote, evidence, and type these things out in that notes section during that early 15 minutes. Also, during the pre-writing, this is where you're going to read through everything. Dave and I have been talking about how we had responses to each of the 4 perspectives, some fairly benign, some a little stronger in both directions. Read all of the perspectives. I don't know if it'll always be 4, but read them all and see which 1 or 2 you have the strongest reaction to, for, against, but ones where you can most thoroughly engage. That's the trick. And then type some quick thoughts in the notes on that as well. And then when you feel ready to go, get into the essay and start writing. And this is where you have to obviously be more mindful of how you write. I'm not going to turn this into like some English prose lesson. You're all welcome for that. But as you start to write the essay itself, I would probably go back to like high school 101 when it came to writing these things. I don't mean 5 paragraphs, but start with a thesis of sorts in response to the key question. Get it out there very clearly right away, how you're going to try to defend a response to it, what that response is, what you're going to do. And then the main body of this, whether it's 2 paragraphs, 1 for 2 each perspective, say, or you stretch it out a little more, it's going to be built around whatever perspectives you choose to address. You can use them to support your position. You can elaborate with your own thoughts and experiences. You can attack those perspectives directly. You can use them to attack something else if you want. But the key is, how do they relate to your central thesis, your central point, and how well can you defend it based on what other people are saying? And then the last point I'll make here, and Dave, I think you alluded to this, but I'll say it again. The key here really is quality over quantity. Schools aren't doing a word count on this. If they read it, they're reading it. So make sure what you write is well crafted and well considered, even if you don't write maybe as much as you thought you could.
Yeah, shorter and higher quality is going to be better than longer and sloppy. And if you're listening to this and you're like, boy, this sounds familiar, this isn't the first time this general format has appeared in standardized testing. I think the AP US history tests have something like this. The ACT has had essays like this before. And so this isn't like some unique thing. And in fact, one of my complaints about this is that, hey, maybe it would have been nice if they really like leaned into the legal sphere. Maybe all the issues were legal in nature, and now we were having discussions about those. You could still even have the same format. Instead, they've used this broad social topics. I'm sure there'll be moral questions, things like that. Nothing too salacious or, challenging, but something where it's just like, oh, think about all these different issues and the operation of society and all that stuff. So I wish they would have actually taken the fact that this is the law school admissions test and leaned into that, but they chose not to do that. And as to your kind of like fictionalized comment, yeah, it does allow for you to bring in personal experience. And that could be, well, my parents did this, or they had this particular experience. I don't know that people need to go out and make something up, wholesale, but I'm not even sure it could be found even if they did. And quite honestly, in some of the SAT essays of the past, that was part of the advisement, is you can just make stuff up. They only care about your form, not the actual facts of what it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think that is largely going to be the case. But if you stick to that kind of key question and working with either attacking, supporting, cutting apart the viewpoints that they give you, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape with that.
Yeah. Now, I remember doing that on the SAT for what it's worth, assigning quotes that I'd never even heard to famous people, just because that quote itself would have supported what I was trying to say. I think there was one about aiming for perfection even though you can't get there helps you to be the best version. I was like, yeah, as Michael Jordan once said, and I just made some quote up. I'm not suggesting you do that here.
No, we're not.
Okay, then I'm suggesting you don't do that here. But the point that these things are really trying to establish is, given whatever evidence you might be able to conjure, how well would it support your point? This isn't about the nature of the evidence. It's about the value of the evidence. And that's what I think people should keep in mind.
The relative power of the support or criticism in relation to really what is your main thesis / conclusion. This is really kind of like an exploded LR argument, RC type of passage that you're writing for them, where you're looking at different views and kind of slicing things together. And that's not a bad way to look at it when you start kind of thinking about how I'm going to put together a response on this. Now, if you're thinking, all right, that sounds cool and all, but I want to see one of these to really understand the example that you're talking about, LSAC's got one on their site. You can go to the LSAC.org site and take a look at it. And they've got an example. They call it the argumentative writing that is going on. And so you can take a look at that. Just go to their website. It's pretty easy to find. There's also examples in LawHub. You have to go to the August 2024 admin or later format button. So if you're in the current one, they'll show you a current writing. But if you go to that August 2024 option, you can go take a look at the same exact example and kind of work through it. They allow you to work through the notes section and so forth. You can actually go and do it using the interface that is relatively pretty similar to what you'll actually see on test day, or at least LSAT writing day.
Yeah, for what it's worth, between those two options, they are the same example, the same perspectives, key questions, all that. The one that's just static text on their website, and then the one where you can actually get into the interface and play with it in LawHub. I would encourage you to do the one in LawHub just to get a feel for what the timer is like here. How much can I type in 35 minutes? What does that first 15 minutes feel like to make notes? It's one thing to think about it. It's another thing to actually experience it. So given those options, take LawHub.
Second that. So let's close out with some general questions, John. And I had actually posted this originally on Reddit when they updated it, and got a bunch of really good questions that I thought were very useful, and I know that a lot of people will have on their minds right now. So the first question that came out was, do schools, if I already have a writing on file, do I have to get a new one? So you took it in the old format. Are you now required to go back and take a new LSAT writing? And of course, LSAC in their very vague press release on this didn't address it. But I was able to get the answer, which is no, you don't have to have a new one. If you have the old format, that is completely fine. Which then leads to the second question. All right, so some people are going to have old, some people will start to have the new one. Some people may even have both if they choose to do it that way. Do schools care about which writing type of prompt that I actually have on file? And I think this is the more interesting question of the two, because it requires like some kind of thinking about the way things will work and do work in law school admissions offices. Right now, they won't care. They're very familiar with the old format, and this new one is so new. In fact, right now, no one even has one, but they will, starting in August and September, that they don't really have a preference. I think they'll take a close look at the new ones as they're coming in, but it is going to take them time to adjust to the new reality. Eventually, the old ones will die out. And so quite naturally, we're going to have a shift here. But early on, schools are not going to care which type. There's not going to be a school that says, hey, we really wish you had the new argumentative prompt on file. That would just change things for us. This is not moving the needle in a huge direction either way, unless you do something really radical, crazy, or ill-advised inside what you have actually written. So as long as you write either one of these well, you will be fine. So that is not something to be too concerned about. I don't think it makes a difference one way or the other, and it won't for a while.
Before you continue, I'm just going to ask you a personal question. Which would you prefer? If you were doing this, which of these two essays would you rather have?
Oh man, the old one.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
It's less work.
It's less time. It's less work. There's less decisions to make. It's more structured. So yeah, if it's up to me, definitely the old one.
Yeah, I can just go in there and balance which criteria and which option plays best and which one I feel more comfortable with, and then immediately support one and start attacking the other. It's very, very straightforward. So you can see that just on that basis alone, they've made it more complicated to deal with. And that's their choice. I'm fine with that. And that does raise an interesting question. If that old one was so straightforward, really what that did to me was it just showed off my writing ability. Now I can go in there, and if I am a strong writer, I can display that, and they think to themselves, all right, that's smooth. That's what we expect from this level of school. That's really what the writing sample was to me. If checked, do you match what they expect from an intellectual standpoint for their school? So now the question is if this new one is more challenging, if it's more complex or complicated, will schools start paying more attention to the LSAT writing going forward?
I think they should, frankly, as much as I've always kind of on some low-key level detested this whole part of the LSAT. This is a more challenging writing exercise. It's more nuanced. It's more student-driven. I do think schools should and probably thus will. And frankly, it's also, as you have mentioned a couple of times, I think this is inroads to what will become a scored writing assessment on this test.
I think it assuredly is on that path, but I do happen to agree with you that, especially first off, because it's new, they'll see that and they'll be like, well, this is curious. Let's go check it out. And so they'll kind of engage with that. They'll see how it's different than what they have been, really used to for years and years. So they'll kind of work through that. But then if it does actually produce essays that are more nuanced and really showcase your writing ability a little bit more, then you could see them actually saying, hey, let's at least look through these. Let's glance at them. It might be easier for us to understand what is a glaring error and what is, something that is like, hey, this person has talent that we didn't notice. If you have a really formulaic type of essay format, as we do with the decision prompt right now, it doesn't lend itself to really being very flashy or showy. In fact, most of the advice that you get, and I agree with it in general, is try not to be too flashy because it just looks like you're showing off. This may allow for a little bit more of that, and that may make this more usable to law schools going forward. LSAC certainly thinks so. Now, you said something in there, John, that I think may catch more than a few people off guard, which was like, the road to a scored writing assessment. Like, what's that all about? It's not just speculation on our part. Like, oh, geez, they may do this. They actually say in the announcement that they made, and I quote, over the course of the 2024 to 2025 testing cycle, so that's essentially July 1st to June 30th, so ending June 30th, 2025, we will be analyzing data on the new LSAT writing prompt to assess its validity and reliability. Now, it's just an essay, so honestly, that part's not what is key. with a long-term goal of providing a scored LSAT writing assessment that schools may use in their holistic admissions processes, which is their way of saying, we are going to run every one of your essays through an AI and see if we can go ahead and get a score out of it. And then we're going to use human readers to test those scores and see if we can come up with baseline ideas, a rubric, as the teachers would call it, that will give us a scored assessment. And then we're going to create that scoring scale. And then we're going to go ahead and start producing that. So schools will get whatever your score might be. And is it the GMAT where it's like there's a 6 and there's a 5 and a 4 and so forth? I don't know that they'll use that scale. In fact, I would strongly recommend that they not, because everybody gets a 4, 5, or 6. And so it's like, that's not really all that useful. But the key thing there is they're going to start analyzing these with the eye towards creating a scored writing assessment. And I am positive that they are going to do that because they feel like that's going to be another piece that separates the LSAT, even though other standardized tests have done it. The other part of it won't happen at the earliest before mid-2025. And I would imagine that they won't, unless they see something very early on that's like, we can do this, it might not be until 2026, but I think it's coming.
You did say one thing in there that I know the first time I heard you say it, my head swiveled a bit, and others may have just then as well, which is this is very likely to be scored, if not entirely, at least largely by some sort of machine learning AI device. This is not unprecedented. The GMAT has done this for years. In fact, the GMAT used to do one, what they called e-reader or e-rater, and one human.
Rater.
Yeah. And one human. And as long as they were with 1 point of each other, they would average them. Same score. Obviously, that's what you got. A 4 and a 5, you got a 4.5. So there is precedent for this, and it goes back a ways. The good news about an AI is there's only so many things that they can program into it, which means they're kind of beatable with algorithms, or at least predictable things that you can include in your essay to satisfy, quote unquote, the AI metrics and weighting that get used. This is all built around formulas. And if you kind of know what those formulas are, you can tilt things in favor of the formula itself. So don't panic if you hear that, like, I'm going to be graded by a machine, not a person. You'll be all right.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because this is actually an area of some interest to me. I actually studied the E-Rater system quite a bit some years back, and it disturbed me deeply. Now, at that point, the technology that they were using wasn't fantastic. So, there's an old world, new world thing, and it was beatable. Like, one of the things the E-Rater looked for was transition words. And it credited you extra if you wrote a long essay. And so you could literally start telling people, hey, make sure it's not short, make sure you use a lot of transitional words, and it would start to fit the profile of what an E-Rater thought was a good sounding essay. The weird thing about the way the E-Rater and the GMAT system worked was, yes, you're completely right, John, there was a human reader and an E-Rater score. And so they would use the two of those. And then, if they were close enough, they'd be like, all right, we'll average those two. What ultimately happened, though, as I recall it, was that the way the system worked was if the human was too far off, a lot of times they went with the E-Rater score. And so what happened was the human readers adapted how they read to match what the E-Rater was looking for. So, because as people, they were like, gosh, you and the E-Rater disagree a lot. You're not a good employee. Versus, Jimmy next door is like, Jimmy and the E-Rater agree 99% of the time. Jimmy's an optimal employee. And it's like, no. So the humans, the stories that I would read from them when they would talk about this is that we actually adjusted how we graded to make sure it matched the E-Rater as much as possible. And I remember back then, and this was a good 10 years ago, being deeply annoyed by that statement. Not fearful, but just irritated. I'm like, this is exactly how machines take over the world. The difference we have now is I wonder whether or not they'll even have humans involved in this after the first couple of rounds. Once they establish that the human scores and the new E-Rater AI scores, are not that dissimilar, they may just drop the humans. And that is primarily because, as we all know, the new AI technologies are outrageous. I've said this to you before, John, is that, we have meetings around here and they use Copilot AI to summarize them. you can't tell the difference between a human summarizing these very complicated meetings with like 20 people talking about website changes and what a human would have done. In fact, it's probably the AI does a better job. So knowing that that's the case, I feel like this is going to be all AI, and they're going to be like, woo, and just run off to the bank with it.
Yeah, you're right, though. When the human and the machine used to disagree too much, they'd go get another human until the agreement was closer. They just keep swapping in people until there was a match, basically. That's
right. I forgot about that. There was a third person who'd come in and adjudicate, and they found that usually they would go towards the E-rater side, which is ludicrous.
So yeah, they'll have to use humans to calibrate it at first. And I honestly don't know how you train an AI to measure the strength or persuasiveness of an argument. But then I don't know enough about AI in general to speculate.
Yeah, I've been playing with them more than you have, and trust me, they can handle that.
That's crazy. Crazy. Terrifying.
It's not even a question like, I wonder, it's like, no, this is absolutely going to be AI driven. Yes, humans will be involved early on, but only to be like, okay, let's look for outlier cases and do kind of like maybe a control comparison. Like, all right, I would grade this a 90. What does the AI say it is? The big question will be, John, is as we start to see essays come out and scores, is what patterns we'll be able to deduce inside those essays that reveal to us what the AI is actually looking for. So unsurprisingly, it may be that it still will probably really want to see transitions. You know, if you're a good writer, you make it clear where the pathway leads and you leave breadcrumbs along the way to get there. And a lot of those are transitional words and indicators and directions. And so good essays, even if it was gibberish, will have those and could probably get at least some kind of a baseline score. And of course, LSAC won't call me about this because they don't want to hear anything I have to say about their organization these days. But I will say this, I would love to test that thing because I would do just that. The very first essay I put in there would be all gibberish, except it would be like long and have a bunch of like transitional words. It'd be like, so what do you grade it? It better be 0.
Yeah.
You know,
this is nonsense. It better be 0.
It better be 0.
3 out of 6.
Or even kind of like very high tone sounding, you know, idiocy. Like that makes no sense. Those words are all nice and big, but they don't really say anything. It doesn't have to be just like complete gibberish. It can actually sound really good, but actually have no meaning, you know, or it could contradict itself or whatever. I want to know how good it is. We'll have to see those things when the practice actually comes, but it is going to be the case that there's going to be a scored writing eventually, and it's going to be an AI-driven one.
Well, we'll see if we're even still around by then, Dave. The machines may have completely taken over.
Well, John, at that point, they will have listened to all of our podcasts. They will have mimicked our voices and our tonality and our rhythms of speech and so forth, and even down to the diction and word choices that we make. In fact, that could be happening right now, John.
Well, sleep tight, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. This old Dave the Apocalypse over here gives us some great news.
The dark future that I see for us all.
I know.
All right. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else in the world you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or a rating as well. And if you have any questions, we'll certainly do a mailbag at some point relatively soon. You can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon.